Hello and welcome to episode 67 of the Crash and Ride podcast. I'm Patrick Ferguson. I'm your host. This week's guest is Brad Wood. This is part one of a two-part interview because he and I, we got to talking and we couldn't stop. Brad was the producer of the Liz Phair record Exile and Guyville. He also produced records for Veruca Salt, Ben Lee, Sunny Day Real Estate, and Red Meat. He's originally from Rockford, Illinois, the hometown of the greatest rock and roll band in the world, Cheap Trick, and he currently resides in L.A. If this is your first episode of Crash and Ride is a long-form interview podcast where I talk to musicians about anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, and just getting through it, man. My hope is that if we could have honest and open conversations about the things that trouble us, we could start to see some of our sadness in others and start to get better. I saw a thing the other day I really liked. I think it was on Twitter or something. It said, anxiety's greatest ally is secrecy. It's real easy to fall into that trap right now. So many of us are quarantined and isolated, haven't played a gig since March. It's a rough time. As I record this, it's Sunday, September 13th, 186 days into quarantine in 2020. I hope everybody's doing okay. These are wild times, man. You know, later on in this episode, there's a pre-recorded announcement about Backline, a music industry resource for mental health for musicians, and NutriSpace, a mental health resource here in Athens, Georgia, and the National Suicide Prevention Talk Line. But I also want to make sure you know about the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses Helpline. Between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern Time, you can call toll-free 1-800-950-6264. That's 1-800-950-NAMI. That's a mental health resource for suicide prevention and depression treatment. At 24/7, you can always call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. I don't know how everybody's getting through this. Because, you know, a lot of us were surviving on the pandemic unemployment assistance payments because we can't go play music. They say that the strongest indicator you're going to get COVID-19 is you went to a bar. Second strongest is you went out to eat in a restaurant. Those are the two places every musician I know makes their living, really. Like a very tiny handful actually plays theaters and stuff. So without the pandemic unemployment assistance, I don't know how anybody's making bills and rent, and I hope you're doing okay. I'm one of those people who's fortunate enough to be managing to get by, so I'm finding ways in my community to help out. $5 or $10 can make a world of difference to a musician who doesn't have beans or bread. I don't know how anybody's making rent. I know there's a lot of people displaced in Oregon and California by these crazy wildfires, so if you're a musician who's managing to get by in this, find a way to help out if you can. Look around your community and figure out where you can help, because mutual aid is the only way we're going to get through this. Clearly, the federal government does not give a fuck if we starve or get evicted. All right, I got a couple of quick announcements here. Crash and Ride is brought to you in part by Greer Amplification. Greer Amps builds the best boutique effects pedals available. If you're looking for an overdrive, boost, fuzz, compressor, or tremolo that is rugged, road-tested, and at home on stage, in the studio, or in your living room, Greer has a pedal for you. Nick and his staff strive to build the best products around with the best tone you've ever heard. They believe in their products, and they stand behind them too, backing each one up with a lifetime warranty to the original owner. Each Greer Amps product is hand-built in Athens, Georgia, USA. Go to www.greeramps.com or visit your favorite music retailer today. Crash and Ride is also brought to you in part by Jittery Joe's, a local coffee roaster based here in Athens, Georgia. They have a special espresso blend named after the podcast. You can get Crash and Ride espresso, whole bean or ground, off our website at crashandridepodcast.com. Or during pandemic times when so many small businesses are struggling to stay open, I'd prefer you buy that coffee from my friend Seth Hendershot at hendershotsathens.com. That's HenderShotsAthens.com. Hendershots is a wonderful coffee shop here in Athens, Georgia. It's a great place to read or write or study or hang out and meet your future ex-wife or future ex-husband. It's a great live music venue with a really good sound man and a really good stage. But right now, you know, they're only doing patio service and takeout because of the pandemic. And Seth, the owner, he's a musician. He's a really good drummer. Also, great guy. Amazing dad. And he's doing his best to make sure he doesn't have to lay anybody off during the pandemic. And one of the ways he's doing that is he's selling a bunch of the coffees that they sell at Hendershots on their website, at hendershotsathens.com. You can get the Crash and Ride espresso. You can get the Widespread Panic blend. Widespread, of course, is the great jam band from here in Athens, Georgia. You can get the Kishibashi blend, which is a wonderful dark roast. I'd be drinking that every day if I wasn't drinking Crash and Ride. Kishibashi is a great indie rock band here from Athens, Georgia. Jittery Joe's partners with people like me and them to do these custom blends. They've done one with Cindy Wilson from the B-52s and the Drive-By Truckers. But you can get those 3 blends specifically off Hendershot'sAthens.com. Every dollar goes back into the payroll there and supports live music in Athens, Georgia by keeping that venue open and also supporting a whole bunch of musicians there and artists and painters and writers and just the fucking best people in the world work at Hendershot. So go to Hendershot'sAthens.com and buy some coffee, buy a hat, buy a t-shirt, and support the Athens music scene. All right, man, I sound froggy today. I actually did play a show last night. Pinky Doodle Poodle, Japanese punk rock band from Tokyo, played a socially distant show last night. It was just me, 2 members of the band, sound man, cameraman, owner of the bar. That was it. Live streamed. You can still see that show if you go to the Nowhere Bar's Facebook page. That's the Nowhere Bar, Athens, Georgia, on their Facebook page. They stream the whole thing. It's still up. It was a pretty good show. First show I've played since March. I was a sweaty mess. I'm a little softer around the middle. Got the Quarantine 15 going. Kind of not in great shape. And that band takes no prisoners. That is one rockin' band. That was one intense show. But I made it to the end. Wore a mask the whole time. I'll tell you, it's challenging to play a show with a mask on with a heavy rock band because the thing gets like soaked with sweat and now air doesn't go through it. So all those people complaining they can't go to, Trader Joe's or Costco with a mask on need to fuck off, man. I was able to play an hour-long heavy rock show, and it wasn't easy, but I was able to do the right thing and play a whole show and not complain about it like some kind of candy ass. So next time some anti-masker starts telling you, "Oh, I can't breathe, I feel lightheaded," send them to that show. Tell them to fuck off. We gotta take care of each other. Because I'm tired of not seeing your faces. I miss shows. I miss going places. Okay, Brad Wood. Would have never met this guy if I hadn't interviewed Riley Walker, who's also from Rockford, Illinois. And he listened to the podcast and reached out like, "Hey, man, I really appreciate what you're doing." And I was like, "You're the guy who produced Exile and Guyville. Holy shit." Like, I fanboyed all over this guy. I'm just a huge fan of his work. And so I asked him, like, I want you to be on my show. Will you do it? And he said, sure. And at the time, I was looking at maybe flying out to L.A. I've got a couple people I want to talk to out there. So we had kind of tabled it. Like, we'll talk when I'm able to come sit at your kitchen table. And then COVID-19 happened, and I haven't gone anywhere except the Nowhere Bar to play one show in 6 months. But then, he knows Dave Pajo, and after the Pajo interview came out, he contacted me and he said, "Man, I love that episode." And I was like, "Thanks. It's time. Let's just do this over the phone." So I hooked it up. I called him late one night. This interview happened, I guess I went to bed at 4 o'clock after it was over. He's West Coast Pacific time. I'm East Coast Eastern time. And we talked all night. It was such a pleasure. Like, I really enjoyed getting to know him. I really enjoyed his insights on a bunch of stuff. And what's interesting is, like, I'm a wide-eyed, like, I still love music and love playing music professionally, and I still love being around people. And even after all these years, I still find a spark of joy in it. But Brad makes me look like a jaded asshole. Like, I was really impressed at his ability to still feel fresh about it and still love the process and still love making records. And I just, I'm really glad we got to talk. In the first part of the interview, we talk about his early life and his early music career. He was a professional saxophone player, played in wedding bands and stuff, went to college for it, and then just took a wild turn when he got to Chicago and became a drummer. We talk about that first tour with Liz Phair and her reluctance to be a live performer. Her first show, the story of her first show is absolutely mind-blowing, and it's in this first part of the interview. We also kind of go down a rabbit hole about bikes, but, I mean, a bunch of the people who listen I know are also bike guys, so I left it in because bikes are cool. And we talk about the current state of the music industry and what it's like trying to make records for money these days, and that's all part one. I'm not going to wait a whole week to release part two. I'll probably put part two out Wednesday night. I've just got too many interviews waiting to be edited and released right now. I talked to Lily Hyatt, as I mentioned last week, daughter of John Hyatt, also a fantastic singer-songwriter in her own right. I've also talked to Conan Neutron lately. He's got a very prolific podcast of his own called Protonic Reversal. I talked to drone composer Jody Shapiro. She's from New York. She's worked with Glenn Branca and Reese Chatham and has a body of work that for some reason she refuses to release. And one of my missions in life is to get her to release another Walking Shadow record because it's really good stuff. I also talked to my friend Chris Harrison, who used to be in the band Trinket, which was just an epic tale of music industry insanity gone wrong. And he's now a writer at Adult Swim. And just that may be the funniest crash and ride yet, so look forward to that. So it is hopefully the last part of quarantine has turned out to be really productive for crash and ride. So I'm looking forward to all those episodes, and I hope you are too. In the meantime, let's jump into part 1 of our interview with Brad Wood.
Yourself?
You know, it's such a different question to answer these days, you know.
No kidding.
I just tell people I'm just hanging in there like damp cilantro, you know, like it's just kind of always hanging in there.
So is your child asleep?
Yeah. So you have kids?
I have 2 daughters. One is 23. The other one is 17.
Wow, man. You're almost across the finish line.
You're never across the finish line with your kids.
Yeah. I guess not.
Always parenting them, always, if you're doing it right.
I started 2020 like cutting way back on all animal protein because I started to realize that like I'm an older parent. You know, I'm a little past 50 and I have a daughter who's 10 because we adopted really late, you know. And my dad is still around, and I still call him, you know, to be like, hey, is 4% a good interest rate or not? Like, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I don't want my daughter to be blindly making those kind of decisions when she's, you know, 25, 30 years old.
Yeah, you got to stay in shape.
Yeah. Man, I don't mind telling you that, like, because I always do a lot of research before I do a podcast, and every picture you look like a 30-year-old dude. Like, I don't know what you're eating or, like...
Well, when I was in my 20s and my teens, I looked like I was 30.
So you just pumped the brakes and held it there?
It really was... It worked to my advantage when I was younger because you know, if I wanted to get into a bar or whatever, I almost always look older than my age.
Yeah.
So... I definitely see myself aging, you know. I mean, if you compared pictures of me now to 10 years ago, you would see, I think, a pretty obvious difference. I'm getting jowly and gray, and I'm not dyeing my hair. I'm not going to, and my hairline's receded a bunch, and I'm pretty bald back. But I think a lot of it has to do with just knowing how to take a picture of yourself, because everything, you know, it's mostly selfies, you know, these days. And I think because I always looked older, now that I'm actually older, I just look my age. So I think there's some of that still going on.
Yeah.
When I was 30, I looked 40, and when I was 40, I looked 50. Now that I'm 56, I look 56. And I sort of take care of myself sporadically. I'll get obsessed with cycling or some sort of calisthenics or light exercise. But in general, I've got pretty good eating habits and moderation, you know.
Yeah.
In all things.
On the cycling thing, like road bike, mountain bike, gravel, what do you do?
Road bike. I've got a mountain bike. I've always had a bike, just like most of us, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I rode a lot when I lived in Chicago and was commuting to work downtown from Wicker Park. And that was on a mountain bike because those were sort of like the new thing. So it was exciting to get a mountain bike back in the 80s and do that. I had a road bike as a kid. Bought one in 5th grade with money I'd saved, and I bought a French road bike. And
what bike was it?
It was a Mercier.
Wow.
Yeah, I bought it from a bike shop in my hometown, and I took really good care of it. And I had a subscription to Bicycling Magazine, and I built panniers to go on it, and the whole thing back then for me, it wasn't racing; it was to go on long distance rides. And a buddy of mine who lived a couple doors up from me and I would ride our road bikes from northern Illinois to northern Wisconsin and camp, sleep under the stars with a sleeping bag, and put thousands of miles on that bike.
Man, I had the similar obsession. I was really into distance cycling as a teenager.
That's cool.
Yeah, I didn't have I had some Japanese frame, like a Univox or something. And now I have a Univox High Flyer guitar, so I guess it's full circle.
Univox made pretty much everything for a while there.
Yeah.
And I got back into it as a result of Me Without You working on their second album with me in 2006. And this is the second time they drove out from Philadelphia to Los Angeles. And this time they parked their tour bus in the parking lot of the place they were renting. And they all got bikes off of Craigslist or had already brought their own bikes out. And they rode bicycles to and from the session, like a gang, bike gang.
Man, that's great.
Oh, it was so cool. And I was already kind of road bike curious again. I'd been mountain biking and riding around with my kids, on the back, or just kind of puttering around running errands on my bicycle. But I felt like I wanted to do something more. So at the end of the session, Aaron Weiss, the singer of the band, just gave me his bike that he bought out here in Los Angeles. He bought it used, and it was an old Specialized. What was it? What is it? I still have it. I forget what it is. I've still got it. It's in the shed. But he gave it to me because as it turned out, it was too big a frame for him, and he had a bike back home. So he gave me this mid '80s road bike, Specialized, and I started riding, and then the bug hit me. And as it turns out, one of the things that is great about intense cardio like cycling, if you do it right, is all the wonderful brain chemicals you get released, and it's helped alleviate my depressive episodes dramatically. So I ride not just to be healthy and to be outdoors in the mountains in Los Angeles, but I ride sort of for the sake of everybody in my household.
Yeah, what's the bike culture like there? Because here, if I'm out on my road bike, there's a strong possibility that one out of every about 30 rides, I'm going to have a hostile interaction with a motorist to the point where we might have to actually fight.
What?
I'm serious.
Really?
Yeah, especially in the last 4 or 5 years since current president sort of released the hounds of the cargo cult of masculinity, where it's all about a truck and guns and this sort of material trappings of traditional masculinity gone completely amok.
There was a rash of cyclist car driver incidents that were sort of infamous, maybe 2009 or 10 or 11. And there were road rage kind of incidents where a heavily ridden road in Los Angeles, like usually it's a climb or a descent, and it's usually in the hills, Hollywood Hills. But there were it was like a string of them, and they were basically incidents where somebody's backing out of their driveway, and a bunch of road cyclists on a weekend are just kind of barreling down these canyon roads or going up too slow. And a couple times they would have interactions. And one guy actually ran down, I think there's 2 guys on bikes, pulled in front of them, slammed the brakes on, and one of the cyclists went through the rear windshield, through the rear window, and broke his jaw and all his teeth and had to have a bunch of surgery. And that guy, the driver, he went to prison for that. That sort of made the national news. But I gotta be honest. I haven't experienced almost any road rage or incidents with cars since moving here and riding like in earnest in 2008. There's a handful maybe where somebody, I think one guy got a little close to roll down his window and yell, but I have experienced a lot of that on rides in rural coastal cities in California farther north.
Yeah.
So I think it has to do with who you're meeting and what kinds of roads you're on. So not a lot of stuff in Los Angeles, because I think most people here are pretty accustomed to people on bicycles, and there's a lot of us on bikes. And I don't know. I think it's just it's a big urban, pretty urbane city.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, the culture out here is compared to Chicago, where I lived for a long time. It's very accepting. There isn't a whole lot of negative interaction. That's my perception, except for there was a few years where there just seemed to be a rash of it. But I'm wondering maybe if the prosecution and the jailing of this, I think it's a doctor that smashed this guy's face up with his car.
Wow.
I think that might have, maybe that was a bit of a warning. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask somebody who's ridden more than I have until recently. So,
yeah.
But I've never really had too much of a problem. But I get out into rural parts of California, and it's a lot like the rest of rural America.
Yeah. So you're from Illinois originally. You're from Rockford.
Rockford.
Just like Riley Walker.
Yep, home of Cheap Trick.
Yeah, and Cheap Trick.
I have never met Riley Walker in person, only on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And yet an old one of my oldest friends, Leroy Bach, has been his producer on some of his records, and I know an awful lot about him because he's a funny, forthcoming person, and of course the podcast, right? The interview.
Yeah.
He's a great dude. I've never met him, but I feel like I know him, and he's in New York now, right?
Yeah. He's in New York. I'm trying to remember what episode number it was I talked to him. I think it was episode 19.
It was a good one.
I had been following him on Twitter, and I thought he was incredibly funny. He had that Midwestern thing that's like incredibly he's sharp as hell, but also very self-aware and a little self-effacing. And, man, it hit me right in my funny bone. And then at some point he mentioned that he was in recovery, and I was like, well, wait a minute. And that ended up being one of the best Crash and Ride interviews ever, but also, like, did the biggest numbers of any. Like, Riley Walker's fan base is enormous, but very much kind of under the radar.
I don't know how that can be because you're right. Lots of people are fans, and he has a lot of followers on social media. And I don't know why the greater public doesn't know more about him, and maybe it's the style of music that he plays, but he's also such a huge fan of all kinds of rock music and pop music. I mean, he's just a big, he's got big musical appetites, and he does really well in his career. But I'm sure, just like every other musician that's alive right now, they're struggling. He's probably struggling too with the loss of income. I think touring probably makes up I'm guessing the majority of the money he makes in a year. So,
it's rough.
But yeah, he was, but he's also been really public about his struggles. And when I started following him on Instagram, it was before he was back in recovery, and he was hilarious. But I didn't know at the time what I was watching was probably him, altered.
Yeah.
And then he toned it back, and so maybe part of the reason that podcast reacted so well with people is because this stage in his life has been really public, and his recovery at that time was a pretty new thing. So I think people love him, and they're worried for him and rooting for him. They want to check out what he's got to say.
Yeah. So I want to talk about, you and I have spoken via email a couple times about how being a producer and having struggled with depression and periods of sort of manic activity kind of dovetailed in a way. My experience, because I've worked as an audio engineer, I'm not anywhere near as talented, of course, as like I had Richard Salino on. He works at Studio G in Brooklyn. Of course, you've got an enormous resume. You've got an incredible body of work as an engineer. But for me, those periods of time in the studio where a band's like, all right, well, we have X dollars and this much time, and it becomes like a 20-hour workday. And it worked really well with my codependency and my mania, but also the crash that followed was always pretty spectacular. I'm sort of curious, like you have mentioned how the producer lifestyle and sort of midwifing other people's work into the world, sometimes it was really draining and exhausting for you in ways that you had to find a way to maintain.
Oh my God, yeah, it's a hard job. The technical part of being a record producer / engineer, when I say record producer, I think about it in the way that the role is for me, which means incorporates the engineering, the technical part. There's other ways to be a record producer. There's as many ways to be a record producer as there are people, I suppose, who call themselves that.
Yeah.
But when I say as a record producer, I'm talking about engineering, setting up the microphones, running the equipment, knowing the software, helping to arrange the songs if necessary, mixing it, pretty much everything. And it's a hard job to do well, and it's a hard job to do nonstop. And it took me a long time to learn how to manage my career and any semblance of a home life, single or married or married with kids, tough. Especially since most bands or artists, let's just talk about bands in general, because that's what I usually work with.
Yeah.
They're getting ready to come into a recording studio, oftentimes for the first time, or for the first time on a real record label, or for the first time with an album's worth of material that warranted searching out for someone like me, even back when we first started our studio in the 80s, early 90s. But by the time you get around to hiring someone like me, that band has probably put together a pretty good roster of players, and they've written a clump of songs, and they can all play their instruments, and they come in, and the stakes are really high for them. They, as a band, may only do this once in the band's career, or maybe once in everybody in that band's lifetimes. Maybe if they're lucky, they get to do it a half a dozen times. And so it's a very special and pressure-laden and time-intensive period for them. And learning how to keep up with that energy level and that usually pleasant level of stress. But, you've got a goal, very fixed timeline usually, and you have to deliver a finished record at the end of it. And then that band gets to go home and regroup, probably go on some tours or back to their jobs. But as a record producer, if you're lucky, you go immediately into the next album just like that.
Yeah.
And that's where I ran into problems, is that I was, making records back to back to back to back. That was always the goal, right?
Right.
Is it to be as busy as possible. I mean, what a lucky son of a bitch you are if you can string together nonstop work. Everybody wants to be like that. It's a sign of having arrived, of having success, where you're not waiting for the phone to ring or for an email to arrive. You've got albums. You're constantly making albums, and that's a really hard thing. That was a really hard thing for me to learn how to manage. It's just how to keep that intensity level, how to be the best record producer, big brother, father figure in the studio that I could be, and not just completely burn out, because there really wasn't ever, if I didn't allow it or program it in, there would never be any downtime.
Right.
Never any time to recuperate. And so it's taken me a long, long, long time to figure that one out.
When I talked to Patterson Hood from the Drive-By Truckers, and they're output is absolutely voluminous. They're constantly working on. They've always got one record
That's right.
they're promoting, one record they're recording, and one record that they're writing all the time. And I said, man, why are you at this breakneck pace? And he said, because I feel like any day it could stop. And so when you look at your run from Exile and Guyville through the decision to move to Los Angeles, there's just one record after another. And I wonder if some of that wasn't driven by this feeling like if somebody calls and I say no, the phone will never ring again.
Yeah, sure. That's probably a large part of it. This fear that it could stop at any time, and that that hints at the old constant dude that rides shotgun, and that would be imposter syndrome.
Right.
The feeling that you're not worthy of being where you are, and that you shouldn't be given the reins for anybody's project because you're just not that good.
Yeah. God.
And that crippling self-doubt is again, pretty much every artist's constant companion. Mm-hmm. It seems that way to me. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if I've met anybody who's been honest with themselves or with me who hasn't confessed to the feeling that they're really not very good at the thing that they're actually really quite good at. It's insidious, but it seems to be a pretty normal feature of a creative person's life. It's just one of the things that I'm sure we'll be talking about tonight, that seem to be hallmarks, signposts of a life in the creative arts, not just music, anything that involves conjuring up something out of your mind and having it then be existing and for everyone to judge, whether it's a piece of art or sculpture or a building or an album, or a novel, or it really doesn't matter what the actual thing is that you're making, but creating something out of nothing seems to be scary. It almost seems to be always a feature of the high wire actor being on the high dive and not knowing if you're going to stick the landing or hit the water correctly.
Yeah.
One way to alleviate that is just to be super busy all the time and you never give yourself a chance to worry about whether or not you're any good at it. And it's also validation. I must be good at it because I'm making money now and I'm busy all the time.
Right.
So you don't have to actually examine those things. But also part of it was just I really love being a record producer. I really like being in the studio. And my favorite part of every record I've ever worked on is the day that it's done. That's always like the best for me. I love it when those assholes leave. I love them, but I mean, I'm just like when I finished a record for, artist X and they're done and we hug it out, pre-COVID, and they leave. That is my favorite moment, is to be done and knowing that there's this thing that's been created and soon the world will get a chance to pay attention to it and pass judgment on it and hopefully enjoy it. And I just love that. I love that. I love having yet another title in my discography. I don't know why it's so enjoyable for me, but I really like it. I like the fact that there's hundreds of bands out there, hundreds of musicians, I should say, who have spent time in the studio with me. And when they think about me, hopefully they think about like this tangible, real thing that got created and all the experiences that went into the recording of it. But it's validating to me. It's a thing that I helped these people create, and it's out there. And despite Daniel Eck at Spotify's efforts, it has value.
Right.
And it goes beyond monetary, and you can't know what's going to happen with it until it's out. And every now and again, the world at large reacts in a really intense way, and then it's even more rewarding. But that is always my favorite moment with every record I work on. It's the day that it's done. Yeah, because it's like maybe it's just putting another period or crossing the T It's validating. I obviously I seek validation in some of that,
Yeah, I think most people who don't make records will never know that joy of like putting a bow on it and handing it off to the mastering engineer. But they also won't know the absolute abject terror of the email with the subject line that says "mix revisions?" ? That's oh god, nothing makes me want to dive under a desk than that. But
I mean, I think that because technology has transformed so many careers of many more millions of people than maybe when I started in this industry. I think that a larger percentage of the world now understands what it's like to never be done working. That the 11 o'clock email or the 2 a.m. text, might beckon a scramble to revise. I think the ability for revisions in our world, because so much of it is digital or it's virtual and not actually tangible things that we're making now. Mm-hmm. I think a lot more of the world understands what it's like to dread that email. Like you thought you were done with that report, but you're not, because the head of the team at this corporation finally weighed in, and now we all have to scramble and rejigger everything. I think that's more common now, since we're not making things like widgets and cars and real tangible things. A lot of us are working with vapor now, And but there is something about there's something really soul crushing. And man, it's funny that you brought that up, because I finished an album with Liz Phair. First time we've worked together since 1997, and we spent most of last year on again, off again, working on this album, just the two of us. And it was fantastic. It just a joy to work with her again. And we had a lot of laughs and we had some tears. It was literally, I couldn't have scripted a better experience, at least for myself. Yeah. It was very, very rewarding. Like it just ticked all the boxes. And there were so many nights at the end of the day where, I'd walk into the house and just go, I can't believe that I'm this lucky. Yeah. That somebody I've known for 29 years is working with me again, and all of the water under the bridge with her and I, and in our lives, personal and professional. And yet here we are, like we were able to like whip up out of nothing music again. And we put that album to bed at the end of February of this year, having taken a long time listening to mixes and making revisions and being really fastidious. And Liz is really fastidious. She always has been, but she's maybe even more now, because she's got 28 years in the studio making records and lots of experiences, and she can walk the walk and she can talk the language of engineering. And so when she says, I think this bass part is, maybe a half a dB to a dB too loud, she actually knows what she's talking about. And so she can actually speak in those terms now. But my point was that we'd finally gotten through all this like fastidious mixing, and it was done in February. And then mastering was supposed to happen, and it was supposed to come out in May, and she was going to go on the road with Alanis Morissette for her 25th anniversary of Jagged Little Pill with Garbage. And then she had her own tour booked for this album, the 52-day tour, and tickets had gone on sale the Friday before the global quarantine kicked in. Mm-hmm. And everything stopped, and the release of the record stopped, and it just sat on ice for 6 months. And we sat there, and I didn't really listen to it all that much for long stretches, and then I would like dig in and play the whole thing in sequence and thrilled to it and wonder, well, someday this will come out, right? And then Liz finally got a new album deal sorted out a month ago, and it's hilarious. The record that I had assumed was finished was suddenly being heard with new ears, and I was then asked to make changes to stuff that had been baked in my mind, for 6 months. Like, those cookies were baked and then put into Ziploc bags and frozen, and they were perfect as far as I was concerned. And yet, here I have been doing this for 30 years, and I had to fight my defensiveness,
Yeah. That's why that email is so horrifying.
Oh my God. Yeah. So, but I still have things to learn. I still have tendencies, whether they're immature or juvenile or base kind of defenses, when I say base, like really like basic level, not strategic necessarily, just emotional reactions. I still occasionally have to put up with that. But this is also a really unusual experience to have a record done for 6 months. And the only reason that it doesn't come out on time is because the entire world has decided to sit on their hands for months. So, so that was really unusual. And, the person who was the most eager to hear what the new record label people had to say was Liz, and this is her art and her name on the thing. And she's, in my experience, she's always led the way when these moments come up. She's a good boss. She'll hear an argument. She wants to know what they have to say. She wants people to have buy-in and investment in it. And she knows that I get defensive in probably a less than intellectual way, or a less than pragmatic or strategic way. And as her record producer, I should be the one who's the most strategic and pragmatic. And yeah, it's one of the things. It's one of the unusual situations where I'm not the most pragmatic person in the room.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody's ever described Liz as pragmatic, but she actually is.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Water Under the Bridge and then the Alanis Morissette tour, and I know that you were in Liz's band from 93 to 94 as drummer and saxophone player. Was that, I don't remember when she originally opened for Alanis Morissette, but I saw her on that tour, and I don't know if that was when you were in the band or not.
I wasn't then. I don't think Alanis put her record out till 96. I think 95. Sorry, 95, because it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And by then I wasn't working with Liz. So I was, Liz finished Guyville and needed to have a touring band. She didn't want to have a touring band. She didn't want to tour, but needed to have a touring band. And so it was myself on drums, Casey Rice on guitar, who played some leads and some other stuff on Guyville, and also was an engineer on that record. And a trusted, awesome dude to have around. Mm-hmm. And then our old pal Leroy Bach, who was my friend from Chicago, from Rockford, living in Chicago. We were roommates at the time, and so he learned my bass parts that I played on that record, and he was our bass player, man. And it was a pretty damn good group. We did not get any opportunity to hone our craft. Like our very first gig as a band was New Music Seminar, with Yola Tango opening as a Matador showcase, and Yola Tango was right before us. I think there's like Railroad Jerk and a bunch of other really, God, who else? Was it Pavement? I don't know. It might have been all the heavy hitters.
Yeah. But
we headlined that night, and Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson were there.
Jesus Christ. No pressure.
Ira Kaplan and like they and Paulina Porskova and Rick Kasich, Thurston Moore, and Kim. It was like it was the first time Liz had ever played with a band, and this record had either just come out or it was just before it was going to come out. So it was 1993. It was insane. It was awesome, but it was insane.
Yeah. So for younger listeners who don't really or weren't there for Exile and Guyville and the New Music Seminar, I want to kind of contextualize both of those things. First of all, New Music Seminar was sort of like South by Southwest, but in New York City, and more of an industry event. Every publicist and booking agent and band manager and record label in the country went to the New Music Seminar. And, of course, Matador at the time, red hot label, and Exile in Guyville came out and was just a lightning bolt for, really it was one of, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it was one of the first sort of frankly feminist indie rock records of the 90s in a way that wasn't coy or clever or like in any way artificial. It was a very elemental record, a very direct record, and Liz Phair went from being, you know, somebody most people didn't know about to being a headliner at a show with Pavement and Yo La Tengo. And so that had to be a lot of pressure for her, a lot of pressure for you guys. How did it go? How was the gig?
I loved it. I played 1,000 gigs prior to that. You know, I mean, this is, oh God, I always felt like I was this, just this old warthog, you know, like battle scarred musician that had been in a couple of wedding bands and a million crappy bands that never went anywhere. And I'd kind of seen everybody play before they were famous. You know, like I went to a million shows, played a million shows, proms and weddings and formal dances. And
we should start a club because you just described my career.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I was pretty used to the idea that I was an also-ran because instead of doing what I wanted to do when I was 18 years old, which was to play a different kind of music, I was hedging my bets. It's like, it's weird. I look at my career, like in a way where when you're young and you're immature and you're filled with piss and vinegar and you just want to like grab an instrument and make some noise and you got a lot of things you want to express. You might not have the toolkit to do it, but it doesn't really matter. That's what you do when you're young, right?
Right.
And then as you get older and you have more responsibilities and you mature, this is allegedly when you get more cautious or you're more pragmatic and more thoughtful. I seem to have done it the opposite. I was trained as a jazz saxophonist and was transcribing saxophone solos, you know, at 12 years old, and joined the Musicians Union at 15 and was playing. I went and bought a baritone sax and was playing various kinds of saxophones, doubling on clarinet and then tripling on flute. So that I could get like a higher union gig. I was playing in big bands, you know, at 15 years old, and then got into a rock band with a bunch of guys who were older than me, and making like money and learning, you know, 100 different tunes that you can play for weddings and formals.
Oh yeah, the fake book.
Yeah, right. You know, like that was. I sort of had an old man's career at 18 years old.
Yeah,
and then I went and studied jazz composition in college, and that was really what most of the people in the saxophone studio were doing. They were all studying the greats of the instruments, and those people were mostly dead. But if they weren't, they were all in their at least 50s or 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And the music wasn't particularly fresh, and the stuff that was electronic was, be like, wow, man, I'm really digging, Headhunters, or I'm really getting down with some Chick Corea or some Weather Report, or, have you listened to the new Wayne Shorter record?
Yeah.
I mean, punk rock didn't register at all in the minds of my fellow students who are also saxophone players, where I spent a lot of my time initially in college was hanging out with those people. And, there's a lot of like brown cardigan sweaters, V-neck sweaters and, wide wale, like flared jeans, and, fashion wise, it was 10 years behind the times if fashion even made a dent. I mean, it just wasn't culturally super relevant. And if I had been a little more brave and trusted my gut or my intuition, I would have acted more quickly on what was really talking to me. And what was talking to me wasn't transcribing any more solos, even though I love the greats of jazz. And, John Coltrane will always be at the top. Miles and Coltrane and Eric Dolphy and oh my God, Steve Lacy and Dexter Gordon and Sonny Rollins. Oh my God, they're just the best, right? But those guys were trailblazers in their day, and they were literally sometimes getting arrested and put in jail, being put in jail, or threatened with their lives, or like in Albert Eiler's case, literally murdered for for just being too damn weird. Like I wasn't, but by the time I was going to college, I was studying a white guy's institutionalized version of this music, and it was just kind of bloodless to me. Right. I wish I had acted more on my intuition back then, but I was suppressing the hell out of it. I was acting really conservative in my creative life as a teenager in my early 20s.
Well, your Midwestern family probably didn't push you towards an artistic career and of risk. Like there's a certain. I'm married to a woman from the Midwest, and the level of practicality she exhibits on a day-to-day basis is incredible. It's not, but she's a professional actor, right? She's now a theater professor, but there's a kind of like, all right, well, look, if you're going to play saxophone, you need to like learn the real book, which is what they call the fake book. For people who don't know what that is, let's contextualize that for just a little bit. The fake book, every working, gigging, melodic musician who does weddings and parties and bar mitzvahs and whatever, there's a thing called the fake book, and it's how many 300 songs in that book? 500? It's the head and the key of every jazz standard, like Misty and my favorite thing.
Sure, it's the pop songs of the day too, where you would but we're talking about from the 40s and 50s into the mid 60s, and then that's kind of it. Rarely any rock and roll. But it's standards. Songs they call standards, which would be ballads mostly, or mildly up-tempo tunes, everything from like the Andrews Sisters to Mel Torme, or Ella Fitzgerald, lots and lots and lots of Count Basie and Duke Ellington,
Hoagie Carmichael,
swing era stuff, lots and lots of swing music, taking the A Train, and but a lot of it was pop. It was pop music of the day, radio hits of the 40s and 50s. Fake book, and then there's like the version of it called the real book, which is kind of a fun spin on it. I still got my fake book and my real book. And they're big, thick things, and you show up for a gig with this book, and they'll call out, the band leader will call out the tune. Sometimes it's just on the fly, and you gotta, or they'll say the page, page 276, like a song from my father, or Girl from Ipanema.
Right.
That was a very, pardon the pun, very real thing in my world.
So, but I think the thing that most people who haven't kind of been around the academic music world know about is that if you have even a little bit of imposter syndrome, the amount of like snobbery and derision and cliquishness and just like outright passive aggressive bullshit that like college academic level jazz musicians have is crippling, man. Like it propelled me out of there was a time when I thought about becoming that kind of drummer, like learning to play straight ahead and being a gigging jazz guy, and but I had punk rock background in high school and stuff, sort of the opposite of what you were describing. And I got to that environment and was like, hey, do you guys you dig any rock stuff? And they were like, no.
Such crazy prejudice against it.
Yeah, it was wild. So that was your sort of college experience, and then you hit Chicago.
That was my background.
Yeah.
And by the time I met Liz, I'd been in, a bunch of different bands, and had never been in a band that had gotten a proper recording contract, that had ever really been very good, to be honest. No offense to my former bandmates in various bands. But with the exception of Shrimp Boat, which was the band I was in when I met Liz, I hadn't been in a band that had any kind of critical or even just any kind of acceptance at all.
Yeah.
I mean, just especially in a town like Rockford, just if you couldn't play original music really and expect to get out to first of all keep a gig on a Thursday night in a bar where people drink hard and drink cheap, and it's like $1.50, Jello shots or dollar shooters with a beer, and people show up after work to get drunk specifically, and what they want to hear is they want to hear like the newest hit song, and the hit song back then would be 8675309, or Jenny Jenny, or they want to hear God, name your poison. I can't even begin. Bob Seger or Kansas. God, Kansas. And so you were always being asked or told to play covers, and if you could do it well, then great. If you didn't do it very well, then you wouldn't get very good gigs and get paid very much. So to actually be in a band where you didn't play any covers ever, you played only original music, that was pretty new to me. Even when I met Liz, I had really squandered all of my teen years into my early 20s doing something else and playing other people's music.
Yeah.
And so, like, man, being in Liz's band and being in Shrimp Boat, simultaneously I was like a pig in shit. I was in the clover, man. I had never felt that happy before and that creatively satisfied. But having said that, I wasn't really nervous at all about playing in front of 50 people or 5,000 people. It didn't really matter to me. I was going to have the same reaction. And I was playing drums with Liz, an instrument that I didn't start playing until I joined Shrimp Boat, 1989. I'd never even picked up sticks before, really.
Okay.
Never sat down behind a kit. Yeah. So that was, and you can tell, you can hear it in my playing at the time. But I really enjoyed being the drummer in a band. That was really cool because it's a great place to sit. You get a good view.
Yeah.
And the count off is on you. And I have a really good sense of time. I don't speed up or slow down. And I pretty much play album tempos live. Like my metronome my sense of time had been drilled into me from the time I was in second grade studying saxophone with a Franz metronome. You learn your scales at 68 BPM, and then you go to your lesson the next week, and they move it up to 70 BPM, and then like practicing to a click was what I did every single time I practiced for hours at a time. I almost never didn't practice with a click like almost any other class. Now, every classical musician on earth practices with a click. And I think that a lot of that sense of time is learned, and playing to a click in the recording studio has never been an issue at all with me. It's very natural, and I don't think it ever sounds like I'm playing to a click because a solid sense of time is what you're looking for in a drummer, at least, right?
Right.
It's like the minimum requirement is to be able to keep time. So I really enjoyed being the drummer in a band, if nothing else, than for not having to try to stop the drummer in the band I might have been in the past from starting a song at the wrong tempo. Like, no, that's not the right tempo. I was that asshole in the band, They would try to stop the drummer. Drummer's going 1, 2, 1, 2. Like no, too slow. 1, 2. It's more like it's like you're like, well, you want the sticks? Why don't you come back here and play this shit, asshole? Right. I had those moments more than a few times.
I've said it as the drummer. Yeah. You want to play them? Yeah. You hold the sticks out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, boy, I've been on the wrong end of the receiving end of that. And well, the sense of propriety on the jazz bandstand is really, really high. Like there's a lot of egos unleashed in the sort of jazz combo world, and it gets really territorial. But so you had a great time at the New Music Seminar gig, but how was Liz?
Terrified.
Yeah, because that's why I brought it up.
Miserable.
I saw Liz live one time. She did not seem at that time when I saw her, which was a few years later, to enjoy the live experience at all.
No, and she's been very frank about that, and has, to her credit, she has learned to enjoy it, appreciate it, and see it for, in some of the ways that it can be really wonderful. And I think she has a genuine appreciation for it. And I've seen her play a fair number of times in the last couple of years, and it's really fun to see her have that much fun on stage, and also to play these songs that, they translate some of them really, really well. I do remember us coming out after Yola, and the roar of the crowd. It was just so intense because, again, this is like, album of the year kind of thing going on, and all this expectation, and all these people standing. And I think it was at, oh God, where was it? You'd have to look online, but 1983 New Music Seminar Matador Showcase. So is it at the Limelight maybe? But it's a pretty big sort of theater, and there's stairs, like metal stairs, like a staircase going.
Was it Wetlands?
Oh, I don't remember. But there's staircases going upstairs to where the dressing rooms are, behind the curtain, and people are standing backstage on those stairs, including like some of these rock star people. And then we start playing, and people were singing. We made the mistake, or we made the right move of performing the first couple songs of the album in order. So we start with 6 feet 1, 5 foot 1, or whatever, 5 foot 2, whatever the name is, 6 foot 1. And people are just cheering, and they start singing the words so loud, screaming back at us that none of us could hear what we were playing. All we heard were them going, "I bet you fall in love too." And it was insane. And I was overplaying, and my leg was already cramping, my kick drum.
Yeah.
I'm like mashing things because I can't hear myself. And I'm looking at the monitor guy who's off to my left, and I'm like off mic because I got a mic to sing backups. And I was like in between where I'm singing, trying to get his attention because he's making adjustments. I get him to look at me. I'm like, up, but I've got to keep playing. I can't use my hands to turn, and like sort of mouthing the words, turn everything up. And so we get to the end of it, and the crowd's like roaring, and Liz turns around and walks over to the riser with like the biggest eyes, like a lemur terror eyes, and she looks at me and she screams, but I can't hear her, but I can see her saying, "I can't hear myself."
Yeah.
But she comes to me to yell this at me, like not into the microphone. She doesn't know about monitor mixers. She doesn't know any of it. We did a sound check, but she was like literally shaking during sound check. And they were screaming so loud at her. Adulation is fucking amazing. And then I got up and like I get the guy's attention. I'm like, turn all of us all up, because all of us were like, can't hear anything we're doing. Like Leroy is like turning his bass amp up really loud. Casey's gone from 3 to 10 on his amps or whatever. And I got off the drum riser to turn Liz's guitar amps up. She had a PV and a twin out of the chorus pedal, for a stereo effect. And I turned the PV up as much as it could, and I turned the Fender up a bunch. And then I ran over to the monitor guy and like just turn everything up. Like this is weird. And then we went on, and she was shell shocked by the end of it. And it pretty much went like that for the rest of that year. For her. Oh God, it's horrible. And I would try to like use my stupid pop psychology and like encourage her in the hotels or like after gigs, try to like buck her up a little bit. I made the mistake of telling my woeful tale of being a hack musician in a bunch of wedding bands and how this is literally like the dream come true. And, and she'd like roll her eyes or like listen as long as she could and go like, yeah, you talk a lot about you, but like, I'm talking about me. I'm terrified. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here. That's mostly what I heard out of her. Yeah. And I was like, nope. This is literally a great thing, and you're going to love this like I do. I wasn't very effective for her.
Well, it sounds like she was having her own battle with imposter syndrome.
Oh fuck yeah! Sure. Also, she just never envisioned herself as a stage musician. She never envisioned herself as a musician. Writing songs was something she did either as a dare or out of boredom. You know, she's an art major and she's a visual artist primarily up to that point, and a really good one too. And she knew her shit about the creative process, and she applied a lot of what she had learned, you know, with that discipline towards making a record. And you know, she said, like she says in her book, you know, I fully expected that once I'd made this record and had my say and proved my point, that I would just be left alone to go on to do other things. That's why she only signed a 1-album deal with Matador.
Yeah. I'm sure that worked out for her pretty well.
Well, that's her story to tell. And she put a memoir out, October of last year. And it's great. And I really enjoyed reading it. She is a multi-talented person who I thank my lucky stars often that I met her when I did, you know. I mean, she's just been one of those people that's been really good to know. And what a great job I have in order to at times meet people who are super creative and riding the edge of, in some ways, like sanity almost, you know. They're compelled. The compulsion factor in our job as record producers is, you know, you're gonna meet, the compulsion factor is almost always there. You're gonna meet people who are compulsive or compelled, is a better way to put it, compelled to do what they're doing. And if you're lucky, that compulsion or that compelling, you know, nature is, when harnessed, is astonishing to witness and be a part of. And again, that's sort of like one of the things that I was hoping to talk about with you today is you know, how to harness that or acknowledge when you're in the middle of it. You know, working with artists who are not always working with the best, you know, the best tools. You know, they may be laying down very helpful tools to having a quote unquote normal life in order to achieve something, and that can be dangerous, you know.
I do want to talk about that, and just particularly in the context of, like, so Exile drops, you do a year on the road with Liz, and you go back to Chicago, and then work constantly for the next, 10 years?
I don't think I've ever really not worked. So, I mean, there have been periods where I haven't been hired, but let's say, till 2000. 2000 was the first serious gap in time in work. So, 6 to 10 years.
So I have this theory about what it takes to get really good at things, and it's not always being, like, emotionally healthy. Like, you know, someone like Jaco Pastorius doesn't sit down and become arguably the world's greatest electric bass player because he's got a balanced life. And we run into these people, me as a session player and sometimes audio engineer, and you as a record producer, who are often frantically creating without really having a harness on that energy. Like, it just comes and comes and comes, and you know, you're in the studio with them, or you're on the road with them, or you're at a practice space with them, and they're having this emotional life, and they're trying to channel this energy, and it's often, as you mentioned, compulsive, and often what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of all-consuming. It's like it's like trying to fly a kite in a hurricane.
Manic.
Yeah.
Jaco Pastorius is a great example of someone who clearly was mentally ill long before he was famous for his art. And as far as I can tell from the documentary and the many articles and books about him, and also his many, many interviews. This is a guy who's bipolar disorder and his manic episodes fueled his insane, that's the word, his superhuman pursuit of his instrument, because he never studied it formally. He's all self-taught. And like the first time anybody ever heard him, I forget the name of the white soul R&B singers band that he was bass player in. He was like 18 years old or 17 years old. He basically like the white James Brown. I'm spacing the dude's name. He's pretty cornball, big white pompadour. He showed up and was able to play literally everything, not even reading music, just was, you know, he was that player by the time he was in his late teens, and nobody had heard him play. He just sort of just showed up at a gig and was boom, and that was it. And by the time he finished that tour, enough people had heard him play that he was invited to New York to sit in on some sessions and meet some people, and was offered a gig, and was jamming with Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter, and was replaced Miroslav Vitwa in Weather Report, and that was it. He just sort of arrived, and I don't think any doubt in my mind that he would have ever gotten to be that great a player had he not been clinically insane.
Yeah.
And that's and it is also the only reason why he died as young as he did, because
right.
He was psychotic at that time, and he was homeless, and he'd been off meds or avoiding meds altogether for years, and so his bipolar disorder had become psychosis, untreated, and everyone lost the handle on him, and it was like a textbook case. His family, his loving wife, the exhaustion set in, where literally this person was literally wearing out the people who cared about him the most, maybe more than he cared about himself. Everyone eventually shrugged and said, I don't know where Guyville is now. I don't know where he's at. Last I saw him, he was like hanging out at the basketball courts, by Washington Square Park. He was homeless chronically, and he was not managing at all. He was clinically insane. He was psychotic.
Yes.
and disheveled and homeless, and jumped up on stage to play with Carlos Santana at a club gig in Miami, where he'd grown up, and everybody in that place knows who Jaco Pastorius is, including Carlos. But he was so altered physically, like with a beard, and he'd been so out of it for so long that physical characteristics changed. He was like wearing a baseball hat and a beard, and no one recognized him. He jumped on stage to jam, and he was ejected from the club, and the bouncers roughed him up, and he hit his head on the sidewalk when he went down and went into a coma and died shortly after. And had he not been the world's best electric bass player ever, he would have just been a crazy homeless guy who, met a pretty common end, death by misadventure, by getting into a fist fight, or by stumbling and falling, or by, living outside rough and dying from exposure or something like that.
Yeah.
And he is literally like he is like the ground zero for how to not manage yourself when you're mentally ill. And also, like, his managers, his record label, his family, his friends, his bandmates, I'm sure have all gone through crazy feelings of guilt and denial and remorse, and could have, would have, like, if we could have only had. I mean, it must have been just so horrible to see him slip away from them and not be able to help, or be unwilling to, or feel like you're incapable of helping him because of how we thought about, or what we knew about mental illness then. It's so tragic. It's so completely tragic, because that guy cranked the music out, and his second solo album, Word of Mouth, is is one of the greatest recordings ever made, as far as I'm concerned. And on the second side of it, he has his little kids, his daughter and his son in the studio, a couple different songs, and he's tickling them at the intro to one tune, and they're giggling. And one is saying that her ears are sweating because she's wearing headphones, and they're waiting for the take to start. And it's the sweetest thing ever. He loved his kids. Obviously, the kind of music that guy made, that guy was bursting with joy at being alive. I mean, he put it into his music, and it's just so tragic that he slipped between the cracks of, social ideas about like what mental illness and the fear factor that is almost like maybe even a genetic sort of fear at people who have who aren't behaving, in their consciousness. They're not reacting to you correctly. That's why everyone gets freaked out by a homeless person who's clearly mentally ill. They give those people a wide berth. We all do.
Yeah.
Because I think that's historically, but probably genetically, we've learned, through evolution to avoid the crazy people because they will cause harm to you and themselves, or they'll make a loud noise, keep making loud noises, and then the wild animals will attack, or your enemies will attack you. But like we shun these people, and it seems to be almost on a cellular level, and that's why I think that we've evolved to be really afraid of people who are dealing with serious mental illness, who are exhibiting antisocial, that's what we call it, at least behaviors.
Yeah.
Also the stigma about artists having to be crazy, and that you can only create when you're manic or when you're crazy. That if you're on medication, or if you're happily married or partnered, you've got enough to eat, you got a stable home life, well then obviously then your next record's going to suck. Or that, a happy, sated person can't create art anymore. You got to be nuts like Van Gogh. You have to be miserable. You have to drink too hard like, Kerouac or all of them, Hemingway or Bukowski. You have to live a miserable life. You have to suffer for your art. I mean, it's such a stereotype. And like all stereotypes, it seems like there's more than a grain of truth in a lot of those things. And how do you wrestle with all that when you're somebody like Jaco Pastorius, who literally the world falls at your feet? And I don't know. It's so tragic, his story.
There's two things I want to talk about the two things you just said. One is that his former bandmates, people who knew him, people who worked with him, yes, you feel a tremendous guilt when someone in your life overdoses or finds a way to succumb to death by misadventure or whatever. But when you're an artist, like, I don't imagine that Wayne Shorter had a guest bedroom at that time. He was living in New York, and people know what it's like to live in New York. You're living in, sometimes your bathtub's in your kitchen. Maybe you got a girlfriend, she doesn't want to deal with your crazy fucking bass player, like living in your house. I know what it's like to be a musician who's got a musician that they love and care about, who's in crisis, but also not have any way to hold space for them, because you're just also living hand to mouth. But also, when you talk about this stereotype of musicians needing to be miserable to create, or this idea that being well fed or having a nice place to live or being partnered up is counterproductive to your creativity, there's a whole industry that profits from those kinds of prejudices. Like, you and I both know that anyone who's nostalgic for major label contracts from the 90s has never read a major label contract from the 90s. And there's a certain kind of cottage industry that kept a lot of musicians, completely zero health care. You had no mental health care or any kind of health care. And you were kind of, allowed little drips of the money that you were making, if you were making any money at all. But, I don't have any nostalgia for that era of the industry at all. Just because, I just knew so many people who were on tour buses, You know, clearly there was money being made. Like, who had like 2 pairs of shoes and, you know, a pretty serious manic depressive thing going on. But as long as they got out there and played the shows, like, nobody was going to break that cycle.
I think the music industry is filled with enablers. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of that is due to people loving music and elevating the people who make music. If you're a fan of music and you really love it, you love it enough where you want to work in that industry somehow, but you're not musically talented, you can't hack it, or maybe you just literally you're tone deaf, you have no interest maybe, but you love music and you want to make it your vocation. So then you get into the music industry, the business side of it. And I think there's an elevation of the artist, mythologizing of these people, like they're exotic, rare creatures, and they shouldn't be forced to deal with the mundane slings and arrows of ordinary life, when what they should be doing is given every opportunity, every avenue to create more of the amazing thing that they create. And I think that a lot of my own experience, that a lot of the motivation for people I've met who worked at major labels, at least when I worked with people at major labels in the 90s, I think the motivations were pretty genuine and not profit motivated, at least not initially. A lot of the people I met, most of them, were people who loved music and wanted to work with artists in some capacity as marketers or A&R, if they're really lucky, or any number of jobs in those industries. And I think that the motivations were good, and even with good intentions, you can still be exploiting the artists. And a lot of times the artists were, part and parcel, like hand in hand, skipping down the road to their exploitation, because they bought into, again, a stereotype of who they were, who they're aspiring to be. Like, everyone wants to be Mick and Keith, everybody wants to be like Joe Strummer, or Mick Jones, who none of those guys are saints. They all partied their brains out, and, they drove nice cars, and they might, or Bruce Springsteen, you in your lyrics and in your public or political life, you say all the right things and you believe these things. I don't doubt any of their, belief systems, but when they come to Los Angeles, they're staying at the nicest hotels, and they're getting bungalows or suites, and they don't maybe drive their cars, like they're being driven around so that they can take meetings, or they can think about, the lyrics for some song, or they can do a bunch of blow and not have to worry about being sober and driving a car because they're not driving it. I mean, there's just so many ways to encourage people to indulge things. And I think it takes almost superhuman effort to not, dabble in some of that and indulge in it. How bad could it be for us to actually live a little bit like the Glimmer Twins? It might be kind of cool to try that for a minute. I mean, we're smart enough to not fall for that bullshit full time. And next thing you know, you're buying scarves and you're unbuttoning your shirt down to your belly button, and you got velvet pants on, and you got a bad coke habit. I mean, I just think there's it's like Disneyland or something. It's like this, like you bought your ticket to the Magic Kingdom, and it's populated with staff and crew that love Disney almost as much or more than you as the fan of Disney who's there for the day love it. And it's because you bought into this idea of something, and a lot of it's fantasy, but real lives are being lived in the middle of this thing. I don't know that it was always manipulation at the forefront. There's all kinds of bad actors in the music business, but there's probably more bad actors in the oil industry, or there's maybe all bad actors in the pharmaceutical industry, or how about the insurance industry? Are there any good people, that can have an honest night's sleep, wake up in the morning and say, I'm a good guy and I work for, Allstate? I mean, the insurance industry is a service that sells nothing, just a hedge against bad news. It's a fear-based, service that people are buying. And you wouldn't buy insurance unless you're coerced or, forced to, or if you're smart enough to know that you should be scared as hell every time you drive a car or, go to sleep at night in Los Angeles and an earthquake might, destroy everything you own. So it's a fear-based product that you're buying, and everyone hopes that you never have to actually use it. You hope you never get hurt. You hope you never, have a bad thing happen to you. So the opportunity to exploit people when they're scared is really high. So I think there's just, whenever there's an industry, any kind of bureaucracy, any kind of money to be made, you're going to get people who will join that industry and really not get the reason why they're there.
Yeah.
So I don't think the major label industry is, particularly unusually bad. It's just that the product that's being sort of tweaked, comes from humans,
Yeah.
If we were talking about the dairy industry, we'd say, well, no cows ever complained to me about, being kept in a horrid living condition, living in its own excrement, pen so that it can't move ever and constantly being milked, or whatever other horrible things that we do to sentient beings so that we can eat food, that's cheap and convenient. We exploit all kinds of things. In the music industry, we're exploiting musicians, humans, other humans,
So in your position as producer, there must have been times through these years where you've been in a room, just you and the musicians, and you've had opportunities to say, I've been down this road. Is there ever been a time where you've been able to kind of maybe help people kind of get through some of these incredibly difficult emotional minefields of being a professional creative person?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. And it's less about being a creative, effective musician in a recording studio, and it's more about, or at least for me, it's more about how to deal with stress and mental health issues and juggling a career that almost never pays enough to actually pay for it, to pay for what you need to make, and also having any kind of semblance of a life outside of it. I mean, I usually it's more basic. The kind of help I try to dispense, or advice I try to dispense, is more about just really basic stuff. Not even about when to practice or anything high-minded, like actually being a musician. It's more about how to be a functioning human.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a certain terror for someone who has a professional artistic relationship with any kind of management agency, be that a label or a booking agent or a management company, of ever saying no. I know that when I had a major label deal, we were all terrified of ever saying no to anybody from the label or our manager or our booking agent. And as a result, there were times when, we were just hammered so thin that we broke.
Okay. So in that, coming in from that standpoint, for sure, I like to think of myself as the advocate, the ultimate advocate, for my client. And if there's a record label or management or some other sort of more important, air quotes, entity than the artist, or, someone to answer to, usually somebody who's written the check, then I'm usually I like to think of myself as the person that stands between that group and the artist I'm working with. And, sometimes it's just working as an interpreter. So let me answer these emails, or let me, send the rough mixes to this person, and I'll include whatever directions for them so that they'll understand what's going on. Or if, the band will say, hey, the label wants to come down and hang out in the studio. Well, great. Let's have them by, let me get in touch with Joe, and we'll find out when Joe's going to make it down. If Joe wants to bring head of marketing, great. So Joe and Suzanne are coming down. They're going to come by at 2, and we'll break for lunch, and we'll play them some songs. What songs should we play them? Should we play them anything? Or should we, sort of manage the process, because I've done it a bunch of times, so that it minimizes like how much agonizing overthinking they might do about these people. Like, these people are usually just stoked to show up and see that their money is well spent, and that, we're not wasting a bunch of time. And also like it's validating for them too. Like, wow, man, got to go to the studio today and see, the band that we're working with, and it was great. And we got to hear some really great tracks. It's just, they've got feelings too. And they also have stress. Like, they have to have, meetings all the time and provide updates to their superiors or their peers. What's going on? Like, how's that band doing anyway? I haven't heard anything from them in a bit. Well, no, they're getting ready to mix. It's, everybody sort of needs help and encouragement. And I just kind of refuse, at least initially, to ever think of anybody at management or a record label as an adversary. They're not. I mean, these are people that are usually hired, or you've agreed to work with them when you're the artist, in advance of ever meeting me. And I need to, at least initially, be respectful of that prior relationship. Like most of the people I work with, if there's a record label involved, they feel really good about that, their point person there. That person is usually somebody who's gone to way more shows of theirs than I have, and know their repertoire usually pretty damn well. And they know, their boyfriends and girlfriends, wives, spouses. They know where they live. They've bought them meals. They probably schlepped gear, to rehearsal. They've gone to Guitar Center with them. They've probably, taken some late night phone calls. These people are humans, and they're enthusiastic. I don't like to go in with the default that I got to put my dukes up and keep everybody away. That comes later.
I was going to say, you said just a few minutes ago, you said at least initially, and I thought that's carrying some weight.
Yeah, initially.
That's doing some heavy lifting.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I have a job to do, and I'm pretty determined to do it. And I haven't really met a whole lot of record label or management people that have the musical experience or musical ability that anybody in any band I've worked with have, or me, sometimes as well. So,
yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean they're without merit. I mean, it's just, it takes a team sometimes to do these things.
Yeah.
And I just don't, in my world, there's no need to diminish these people and their roles out of hand. Having said that, there have been plenty of times when somebody has been, gifted a job that he or she shouldn't really ought to have.
Yeah.
Or maybe this is not a good fit between artist and person.
Yeah.
More often those conflicts come with management.
Yeah.
Because I seem to have more negative memories of various management scenarios. And again, if I'm being generous, I probably have to acknowledge that being a manager is almost like being a sibling, to the artist.
Yeah.
I mean, you're really right in there. So we're talking about mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
They know them, and they've dealt with them already. And then all of a sudden there's this new person, me as a record producer, who's being handed, because of my discography and the band really wants to work with me. I'm being handed a big chunk of responsibility, and this person the door's been shut to the studio, more or less. They're not allowed in most of the time, and they've got other things to do. That's not their job. It's not to sit around and watch a record being made necessarily. Their job is to go out and do other things for their other clients or for this client while they're making their record.
Yeah.
So, that's got to be a really nerve-wracking experience, to have your guys in the studio working with some almost unknown person who's getting paid money, and they're working in my studio, and you just got to hope for the best, that's tough. It probably conjures up all kinds of emotions that might even scan as jealousy, professional, almost romantic sometimes, or at least protectiveness, you're just feeling protective of your friends.
Yeah. Well, you always hear these stories about like Mick Jagger or Michael Hutchence, while the band is in tracking, they'll go out to Ibiza or somewhere and come back and say, fellas, we got to do a house music record, and like it's got to spin out the management when they find out, like, yeah, Mick's down in the studio talking about bringing in Giorgio Moroder or whatever, and
right.
But I feel like pressure on artists now, and I don't know if this is just because there's less money at stake, there's less people banging on conference tables as people are making a second record saying, I don't hear a single. Like, I feel like the relationship between artists and their labels has become, in my experience, significantly less adversarial.
I agree with that. The stakes aren't as high anymore.
Yeah.
And, I think wherever money rushes in, the thing that gets forced out is usually fun and trust and vision.
Yeah.
So when major labels started selling themselves to corporations and they were no longer run by a visionary, usually a man, some dude that started a record label in the 60s or 70s and turned it into a thing, or rose up through the ranks, with a really profound set of skills and a knack for knowing what a hit is, or for identifying talent in a rough musician, and then letting that musician take time to groom, and be groomed and sort of, mature into a Bruce Springsteen, for instance, or a Bob Dylan, or U2, or Elvis Costello, or The Clash. All those record labels were run by one or two people, founded by one or two people, maybe, changed hands a few times, but they weren't run, they weren't corporations, and they didn't have shareholders then. And so they only had themselves to answer to, them and their artists, and obviously the customers. But I think it was when David Geffen sold his company to Matsushita, was it?
Gosh, I don't know.
He made him a billionaire instantly, and that was kind of the end of it, as far as I can tell. Like, it really quickly became all corporate, and then it was short-term profit. And there's nothing that a corporation hates more than unpredictable behavior.
Quarterly losses.
Yeah, so it'd be like having a company like GM, and you want to have 1 million cars being manufactured, and they all meet the same standard of quality. And then you meet your quota the first year, and then the next year there's only 200,000 cars made, and none of the cars, they all look the same, and none of the people that bought the cars the year before liked this car. But that's just what the people who worked in the factories felt like making that year.
Yeah.
Or maybe they were all just tired of making cars, and they wanted to just, do the bare minimum. I mean, that's just not how it works in the corporate world. You want repeatability, and you want assembly line results, and repeatability, and you need to, serve your tens of thousands or millions of shareholders. and they will howl if you don't do it. So the idea of letting Lady Gaga take 3 albums or REM take 5 albums to have a hit, that's, like in the corporate world, that just doesn't work that way. So there's a lot less opportunity for an artist to get a second chance, God forbid a third chance to make an entire album. And for a long time now, it's been pretty impossible for an artist signed to a major label to even have a first chance. You put, by the time they put that first record out, it's been workshopped to death, because that widget has to be amazing. We don't put out as many records as we used to on this record label, and when we do, they have to be massive. It's kind of like the box that Marvel and DC have put themselves in. Box office numbers are so huge. Like tentpole movies now have to be so enormous. They have to please so many people in so many nations, and they have to be amazing right out of the gate. And anything other than a smasheroo, like dynamite movie for a Marvel Comics movie is people will lose their jobs if it doesn't do $1 billion or 150 million over the weekend. It has to hit all the time, and that's just, I think that's just really stupid. I mean, that's applying the wrong kinds of business strategies to the creative industry. It's one of the worst things you can possibly do if you want to have interesting product. If you want to have product that sells really well, then maybe, if money is what you're only looking for, then maybe it's worth the hassle. But it doesn't work very well for music, and it hasn't really ever. But there's so little repeatability in artistic output that I imagine anywhere you can apply any kind of metric, that'll where you can measure something, repeatably, or you can make something happen on a regular basis, so that you can make any kind of plan at all for your, next quarter or your next year. I'm sure they're just going to have to look at it and run towards it, merch or, anything at all. I mean, God, can we make something, how about a video game, or, can we get you into something that is, can you sell shoes like Kanye? God, that'd be fantastic. It's got nothing to do with music. It's barely creative at all, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's just a fucking shoe. I'm so uninterested in Yeezus's, product line. I don't care, and I think his music has dropped, commensurate with his involvement in the fashion and in the clothing industry, the shoes and stuff. He's really stoked about making a lot of money. All he ever talks about is being a black billionaire, how amazing that is. And well, you go for it, dude. But your music is just shit awful now, unlistenable crap. And I think there's probably on a graph, you could map it out, perfectly where he lost the plot with music. He doesn't owe us anything. He's done a bunch of great stuff, and he can do whatever the hell he wants. That's fine. But I don't have to pay attention to him anymore, because those shoes look like shit. Those 3D printed shoes, those are terrible. But my point being that usually some sort of corporate idea about how to make money really efficiently, that's almost always the death knell for creativity. It takes a superhuman effort to interface well with those business systems. It almost never goes well.
All right, so that's part 1 of my interview with Brad Wood. The rest will be out later this week. He's a really interesting guy. I'm really glad he was able to do this. One thing that didn't come up in that interview and only came up in subsequent conversations is he's in a band with one of the founders of the Pogues. The band is called Walker Rotors, and James Fearnley, who was the accordion player in the original lineup of the Pogues, is living in Los Angeles and playing in a band with Brad. And Man, I heard some of it, and it's incredible. They made a record. They were supposed to tour for all of 2020, and then the coronavirus happened. So that album, is it out yet? I'll have to ask him before I cut the intro to the next episode, because the tracks that I've heard are incredible. I want to thank Jake Kreger. He's the de facto producer of the show. Ever since the first episode where he was a guest, he has helped me make the show better by sending me show notes, making suggestions, telling me when things were too loud or too quiet or what to take out and what to leave in. He's an amazing guy. He's also the guy who created and maintains the YouTube channel for the podcast. If you ever can't find an episode of the podcast on your favorite podcast aggregator, just go to YouTube. Every episode is on YouTube. You know, I don't know if you know this. I didn't know this. I was talking to somebody the other day about listening to podcasts on YouTube versus other podcast aggregators. I use one just for Android, but because you can't stop and resume on regular YouTube when you're watching a big, long YouTube video or listening to like a podcast. And he said you can on YouTube Premium. So if you're thinking of going to YouTube Premium and that's something that might sway your decision, you can stop and start episodes of Crash and Ride on YouTube. I want to thank Gene Wolfwick and the band The Powder Room. They provided all the music that you heard today on Crash and Ride. They're a really great noise rock band from Athens, Georgia, currently dormant, but you can hear all of the music that they created at thepowderroom.bandcamp.com. Go there, download the music, throw them a couple of bucks. They're a great band. They deserve it. Gene has got a new project with Erica Strout from the band Motherfucker. They have a band called Dream Tent. That's DREAMTENT. You can check out their stuff at dreamtent.bandcamp.com. A complete departure from what Gene's done in the past and Erica, but I think it's just amazing. It's beautiful. Go check it out, dreamtent.bandcamp.com. Thank you for listening. If you need to contact the show, if you want to be a guest or you have an idea of someone who would be a great guest and you can put me in touch with them, just email crashandride@protonmail.com, crashandride@protonmail.com. No one else reads that email but me. It's encrypted. It's private. I'll never violate your anonymity without your express permission to use your name on the air. crashandride@protonmail.com. I want to thank our Patreon subscribers. You can go to patreon.com/crashandride and make a small $5 or $10 donation per month to help me keep going. That's how we pay for incidentals and hosting and equipment and everything, and it helps sort of keep us in grits and gravy. So patreon.com/crashandride. Well, as I've said already a dozen times on this episode, I hope you're doing okay. I can't wait to go play shows and see your face and hang out and do all the things we did before quarantine. I just can't wait for this to be over. In the meantime, until we speak again, take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. Ask for help if you need it. Go see live music if you can do so safely. Support your favorite band. And remember, loud guitars save lives.